Good morning, friends. We are now in our last session of the Ananda Way of Life, Guidelines of Conduct for Ananda Members. I'm going to ask Keshava, who's helping me. Can you hear the battery being recharged over there? Okay, there's a hum. My bicycle battery is being recharged, but it's not loud enough to come on the microphone, so we won't worry about it. Let's start with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, humbly we bow to you all. Dear friend Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Maybe we already did, but we're doing it again. Dear friends, divine friends, help us to live up to the promise of this incarnation. We have been given so many divine opportunities. Help us not to be parsimonious in our willingness to give to Thee, but wholeheartedly, whole-mindedly, whole spirit. Let us have faith in the promises that You have given us, and to have the courage and the daring to live up to Thy greatness, which You have promised is present in all of us. Master said, most people don't advance for lack of spiritual adventurousness. Help us to be those few who have that spiritual adventurousness and go forward with full faith and energy. Om, peace. Amen. So, here is the very last paragraph of this Article 17 of this booklet. For man lives on earth but a few years, but if we, as devotees of God, can live rightly, we shall live to rejoice through all eternity in Him. God consciousness, meanwhile, remains forever our true and our only lasting home. All else is stewardship simply in His name. Well, you know, it's not for lack of trying. Swamiji has really put forward to us what we're trying to do here. I was reflecting on this earlier this morning, knowing that this was the last class in this very long series, this last session in this long series. Trying to think deeply within myself, what does it mean to be a Sevaka? This series of programs has been going on for many weeks and was done independently because of my morning classes, because I have been for the last year and a half, just picking up various writings of Swamiji that seemed that they might be interesting to dive deep in, that I felt inspired to explore and that I thought might be of interest. Simultaneously with this, there has been a movement within Ananda itself to try collectively, those of us who are members of the Sevaka Order, to think ever more deeply about what it is. I think a lot about the role Ananda is playing in a much bigger cosmic drama. We talk a great deal about this transition from Kali to Dwapara Yuga, how Master came at this transition in order to set the tone for the age that's coming. Master has said that, Swamiji has said that he felt the time would come when Master's teachings, he said not necessarily his name, but the way he expressed these teachings would actually be the defining reality of Dwapara Yuga, meaning that there's just much more going on here. A friend of mine, Rambhakta, did some historical research, simple research, about the life of William, and very specifically the monastery reformation that was initiated by Lanfranc, who Master said was Sri Yukteswar. So this is another incarnation of Sri Yukteswar and Yogananda, except he's King William. William the Conqueror is often called, who went from France to England, became the King of England, and by setting that whole way of governing and culture in motion, just many other things, including the founding of America, took place. Lanfranc was the archbishop at that point. William was the king. Lanfranc was the priest. And Lanfranc started a monastery in Cluny, France. At that time, the Christian church was completely divided between an exceedingly corrupt element and those who were still trying to live piously according to the teachings of Jesus. And the corruption extended into the monasteries and into the priesthood, where there were priests who were not keeping their vows, who were accumulating wealth, who even were fathering children, and it was sort of like that was one half of what was going on, and the other half was this valiant attempt by others to live piously. So Lanfranc, and I don't know all the details, but Lanfranc established a monastery in France, in a place called Cluny, with 12 monks. And of course, with his spiritual power and with the divine mission that they were charged with, which is why they were there, and William's effort over to go to England was also because England was being taken over from Scandinavia, and Scandinavia at that time was pagan, is the word that you would have to use. They were not devoted to Jesus in the same way, and the divine plan was that the teachings of Christ needed to stay central to the European culture. People can rewrite history however they want, but that's what Master was there for. And so Lanfranc did it by starting this monastery with these 12 monks. So Rambakta, just tracing through history like this, 150 years later, the entire landscape of the Catholic Church had been changed. And the music had been changed, the architecture had been changed, the monastic life had been changed, much of the liturgy had been changed. A visual art had also been affected from the manuscripts they were doing and all of that. And it all traced in a straight line back to 12 devoted monks who genuinely lived the teachings of Christ under their inspired bishop. And Cluny monks became a particular thread of the Catholic Church after that. And, from those 12, and I didn't follow it, but presumably, a few of them went off and then became heads of their monasteries, and then a few of them would become heads of their monasteries. But being a Cluny monk meant this certain integrity and dignity and depth and spirituality, which gradually of itself won adherence. It wasn't like there was an ordinance from anywhere or it became the law. It was the attracting magnetic power of that kind of spiritual dedication changed the course of history. So when Swami makes a comment like, what's going on at Ananda will prove to be one of the most important things happening at this period of time, he's not really just being proud or being sectarian. He's actually, because Swamiji was extremely well educated in history in general, in the history of the church, the Catholic Church also, and of course being a self-realizationist and being a direct disciple of Master, he had many ways of understanding things, but part of it was this understanding of how consciousness expands and how higher consciousness gradually influences those who are in tune with it, especially in a rising age. So into the middle of this whole project, because Swamiji started the community in 1968, and I believe this was written the first time about 1983, so it was much later. It wasn't like Swami sort of wrote out our rules and then tried to get us to follow them. 87 is when this was first copyrighted. It wasn't, so it was 20 years. So it wasn't as if Swami wrote out the theoretical idea of what he wanted and then tried to push us into it. Rather, with the natural magnetism of his enthusiasm and the spirit of dedication of the people that he attracted, a Dwapara Yuga monastic life began to emerge. And so in 1987, and I said some of these things way back at the first session of this whole series, but I want to reiterate it now. After 20 years, Swami articulated it. But as I have commented many times going through this series, as I myself get into this deeper, and because I've been here since the founding, I'm a founding member of Ananda, the first Ananda community. I'm considered a founding member of that community. After 25 years, I was the 15th person. I mean, I wasn't the 15th person ever to live there by any means, but of who was left after 25 years, I was number 15, so I was pretty much at the beginning. I've also been a founding member of this community in Ananda, Palo Alto right now, which is now 30 years old. So the point is, I've watched it. I've watched it really evolve, and it was very interesting to me as I went through this. This is what Swami is asking of us, for me to see, yes, of course, we have turned in the direction of these principles. And Swami was articulating what was true of what we were already doing. But oh my, what he's asking of us is much bigger than we have really realized ourselves. We have a long way to go, seriously, as individuals. And I think, this is my opinion, I think this is where the confusion is coming in, is that many of us still have a Kali Yuga idea of what it means to be monastic. I believe I shared with you what happened to me when Swami suggested that I should move back next door to him, and that it was necessary to build a small house to do that. And in order to earn the money to do that, he actually sent me out on the road to teach. So part of what that was about was that it launched me in what has really been my life's work. But the other part of it was an extraordinary moment in my own spiritual life, because if I built a little house and lived in a little house, a little comfortable house, instead of a very funky trailer, would I still be a spiritual person? And the association in my mind between this Kali Yuga image of material impoverishment and spirituality, I had no idea how intermingled it was in my own consciousness, and how genuinely threatened I felt spiritually by the idea of actually having a nicer place to live. And I had to go through a long cycle of this. And you can see a little bit of the house that I live in now, which is, I have one room in this house, and it's in the Ananda community, and it's the community house. This is COVID, so right now it's still kind of a television studio, but as a rule, it's the community house. And I, having a room in the house, help manage and host the whole community on a continuous, ongoing basis. But nonetheless, the words I have to use are, when I had to move into this house, it was very difficult for me. And it's still rather difficult. I mean, I've accepted it cheerfully. I recognize what I'm doing. But it's rubbing the cat's fur backwards a little bit for me to just have responsibility for this kind of a place. Okay, having said all of that, then we can say, oh yes, these are things that have to be overcome. Swamiji came to teach us a Dwapara kind of monastic life, and in his book, Sadhu Beware, and in his book, A New Renunciate Order for a New Age, he articulates some of these other ways, including we have to take more personal responsibility for ourselves, which means we have to be involved in money and the things that money involves, whereas the original Swami order, which is the monastic ideal of self-realization, is when it was organized some centuries ago, the Swamis were forbidden even to handle money. What to speak of having your own bank account. But Swamiji here is telling us that kind of passivity And that kind of absolute rejection of the material world is Kali Yuga thinking, not Dwapara thinking. Okay, all of that, there you have it. But what we have to be absolutely vigilant about, and this is the part I think where, speaking as a life member of the Sevaka Order, I think this is our learning edge of this. We have to be absolutely vigilant to remember the last paragraph that's written here. Man lives on earth but a few years, but if we as devotees of God can live rightly, we shall live to rejoice through all of eternity in Him, meaning God realization will come to us. God consciousness, meanwhile, remains forever, our true, our only lasting home. All else is stewardship simply in His name. Now, wow, is that phrase fraught with personal interpretation. And therein lies the really challenging moment. Like, how do I, and I've come back to this several times and I'll come back to it now. We may not have the luxury of the external definition that Kali Yuga monastic life gave us. I remember I don't remember what country I was in, it might have been Greece, some old monastery, I think that's where it was, we were somewhere. There was this stone room, and it was a marvelous stone room. And it, had no amenities, but some distance away there was a standing water pipe, and it was just a plain stone room in this old monastery. I walked into that room, and I just wanted to stay in that room forever. I mean, really, literally, my companions had to practically coax me and nearly drag me out of that room. Now, of course, it's familiar and so on, but the clarity of world renunciation, it's unmistakable when you're living, when you have one habit that you wear and one that you wash, and you're living in this little stone room. We know what we're doing. When we have to move about this world, to some extent be responsible for ourselves, let me phrase it differently. We have the appearance of being responsible for ourselves when our reliance on God is not so clear-cut as it is when you have nothing, and the only things that you'll ever have are what people give you. To be able to still, in the midst of all of that, be able to hold on to this ideal, this is not my home, and all else is stewardship. What if we're getting married? What if we're having children? What if we're raising those children? And yet, we're going to say, I'm a life member of the Sevaka Order. If we want this to be more than just some kind of social club, there really has to be a looking it straight in the eye, is what does it really mean just to live for God? I remember Swamiji, and this was, for him at that stage, this was no challenge, but it was very interesting to me, where he, after we'd been through all of the litigation, Swami was just so tired of everybody projecting on him all these attitudes and actions and intentions, and he wanted nothing of it. And many years earlier, he had begun to accept a small salary from Ananda every month, Ananda village every month, because he had become convinced that it was necessary for the community to recognize our responsibility to him, quite impersonally. Prior to that, he had earned all the money for the community, but he felt we would never grow up, is how it was put to him by somebody else, and he felt it was true if we didn't take responsibility for Swamiji. So he started accepting that. And then when he went to Assisi, he also accepted a stipend from there. But after the end of all the litigation, he absolutely declared he would not accept any salary from anyone, that God would support him or he would starve. And that was the way it was going to be. And from that time on, he lived another 15 or more years, he just never did. Whatever came unsolicited in a free-form way. That was what he had. Now, of course, the community was taking responsibility for him. He had a home in Assisi, he had a home in Ananda village, eventually he had a home in India. But still, he himself has just said, I live for God alone. This is what I want. And there was another experience, which I've shared with you with him, when he was giving a satsang, and this wasn't for the Sevaka order, it was for the Sadhaka order. And when I did the vows, I talked about that. And in that satsang, Swami was just talking about, I had asked him to talk about what it meant to be a sadhaka. And what Swami started talking about was the level of renunciation at which he lives. And he was talking about when he was expelled from SRF, which was after 14 years in a monastery, he suddenly was completely on his own with a few $100s in the bank. He went to live with his parents, fortunately, who were very gracious and generous and able to assist him at that time. He was 36. They started loaning him an automobile to use. He started teaching around, I think by then he was teaching in San Francisco. He absolutely needed that car. His father generously said, well, then I'll give it to you. Swami's telling us this, and this is 40 years later. He starts crying. Just tears start running down Swami's face. He says, I can't express to you how painful it was for me to realize I was going to have to own a car. He said at the same time, he couldn't just let his father continue to take responsibility for it. He was using it and he needed it. This was his new life. He had to accept it. And then he had to stop for a while because he was weeping like this. And then after he finished, he sort of turned to me in front of everyone and he said, have I given the satsang that you wanted? Is there more that I can say? I said, Swamiji, why don't you talk to them about what it means to be a sadhaka? And then he looked back at the audience, the group there, the Sangha group, and he said, don't even try to live the way I live. He said, you wouldn't be able to do it, and it wouldn't even be good for you to try. Like that. Now, that was good advice for the group that he was talking to. You need to be authentic to your own level of spirituality. Now, many life members of the Sevaka Order have been impressed with Swamiji saying to us, you can become a Jivan Mukta in this lifetime. With Master saying, strive to become a Jivan Mukta in this lifetime, to become completely free. What do we think that looks like? I believe Swami was a Jivan Mukta, that he was free when he was there was no ego left in his consciousness. And he's telling us what true renunciation looks like. He's telling us in this booklet what true renunciation looks like. We live on this earth for a few short years. God consciousness is our only home. Everything belongs to God alone. I relinquish all thought. Henceforth, I relinquish all sense of I and mine in my life. I offer all that I own, that means everything that we have externally, and all that I am at the feet of infinity. All else, our home is in God, all else is stewardship, simply in His name. Worth really meditating on, isn't it? We're going to ask the community, any major decision I make in my life, I'm going to discuss it with the community. Even if I get married or not and who I marry, I'm going to talk to them about it. I give up all considerations. God alone is my only reality. Is it? If we want the power of what we're doing to really change our lives, I think a lot more spiritual adventurousness might be needed. I'll speak for myself. I'm not sitting here saying I'm doing this. Listening to Swamiji talk about what it meant to him to own a car, I think, wow, I own a car. I was really happy when I was able to buy it. I'm always, Okay, let me say it clearly. The Sevaka path is simple living, simplicity, not austerity. Swami, by the time I knew him, I mean, he had a car, he had several houses, he'd furnished those houses. He enjoyed buying gadgets from whatever sharper image it was at that time. And he would go through the catalogs, and every Dwapara Yuga gadget, that was just some clever new way of using energy or making up. He was fascinated by all those. He was very interested. We traveled. He dressed nicely. All of the things I talked about when I was talking about simplicity. But the question is, how deeply detached are we? Because we are not being given the luxury of that stone cell. But we are also not being given the luxury of only being half dedicated to God. Our dedication has to be as complete as those impoverished monks, as complete as St. Francis's monks. There's no in-between with this if God consciousness is our goal. If we want to get a little good karma and make a little progress, we can do that. And how that expresses? Well, Swamiji has given us lots of leeway. But understand within ourselves, this is our real job. If those of us who are Sevakas really want to make this real, we have joined a monastic order that is not a whit less demanding than any of the monastic orders we were ever in our Kali Yuga adventures that got us to here. It's God alone. From now on, I relinquish all sense of I and mine. Is that the template that we're using every time we make a decision? This is I find it very helpful, and I have a number of important ideas pasted on the walls of the room in which I live, because I want to keep it really simple. I want to ask myself, what am I really doing? I have the Nayaswami vow. I had the Sevaka vow for a very long time, but in a certain sense, the Nayaswami vow has become central at this point. But I've been extraordinarily inspired by recognizing the magnitude of the Sevaka Order is no less than the Nayaswami vow that I've taken. They have slightly different intentions and slightly different focuses, but it's no less. God consciousness is our true home. All else is stewardship in His name. God bless you, my friends.